I'm a senator now in the area where I was born and raised. So I was born in White Center, raised in Burien, live in what's called West Seattle in this area, and that's where I'm the senator. And and I work, probably more than I should, is because my story, despite how sad it is not unique. There's a lot of us that experience this kind of trauma and pain that need help. And if I can help the next whatever Joe Nguyen, that's a big victory in my book.
Yeah. Welcome to The Vietnamese. I'm your host, Kenneth Nguyen. Being part of a culture of nearly 100 million Vietnamese people in the world today comes with a lot of pain, proud history, and privilege. Join me as I highlight and explore the Vietnamese experience from all over the world. Hi, Senator. How are you?
Not too bad. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you for coming on and spending the time with me.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. And honestly, I'm in the middle of a campaign, so largely my time is like randomly calling people. So being able to just sit down and reflect a little bit, I think is a great joy versus, having some of the tough conversations that I have sometimes.
Well, hopefully we'll make this easy and fun at the same time.
Yeah.
So how did your family arrive in the U.S.?
It's like a lot of people that came here as well. So what's interesting is my father fought with the South Vietnamese Army with the U.S. Navy, and he evac'd out with the Navy, right? But my mom, by the time they got word to her in the village that that was happening, they had already left. So for about 3 years, she had no idea if he was dead or alive or in the United States or not. And then what was interesting is that during that time, he would try to send letters to Vietnam because you didn't have a cell phone, you didn't have
Right.
emails at that point. But then they were blocking messages from America to Vietnam. So he ended up sending letters to Japan, and then Japan then to Vietnam, realized that he was alive. And at that point, he was saying, hey, there are people leaving on boats. There are people leaving on boats. We live in a fishing village, leave on a boat. And they tried back in 79, got caught. All the guys jumped off because I think if you were a guy and you got caught trying to defect, it ended up bad. So they then did it again in the 80s, made it. I have a picture of the boat in my office where it's just crammed onto a tiny, barely a raft that the U.S. Coast Guard took off the coast of Japan. And they were picked up by one of the fishing vessels, made it to Japan, and then from there made it to the United States after that.
What part of the United States did you land in?
In Seattle. So we were there because we had access to public housing, but also there's a guy named Skip Lee who was then legal advisor for the governor Dan Evans at that point. And despite being, it's funny because Republicans back then were actually very open to immigration. They're not now. But Washington State was one of the states that actually opened them up for immigrants to come and refugees to come. And it was because of this guy named Skip Lee, who was legal counsel for then governor. And it was interesting because that's why there's a high concentration of Vietnamese people in Washington, specifically in Seattle. I got to meet Skip and I randomly, got to thank him as well because we were doing some other stuff. And he had talked about his time with the governor and Dan Evans and all that stuff. And I was like, you literally are like, there's a very good possibility that my family's here because of your work back in the 80s. So like being able to thank him, being able to thank the governor at that point. And it's funny because I'm in the Democratic Party and much more progressive. But seeing kind of how they opened and their open arms for us here, I thought was pretty cool.
Yeah, you bring that up, the whole progressive. What do you think made you become a progressive?
It's fascinating, right? So like if you look at our community, oftentimes the elders in the Vietnamese community tend to be a bit more conservative for a variety of reasons. But what's interesting, if you look at what we truly benefited from, right? So I had access to public housing. I had access to public education. Healthcare was a big deal. My father was in a car accident that left him quadriplegic. So healthcare was a big deal. So growing up, I saw all these policies that helped people like me. And being able to see where that was coming from, I thought was important. And I gravitated towards the Democratic Party because of that. And candidly, one of the reasons why I am progressive is because, when I was a young kid, we had it pretty tough. My dad was in his car accident, so basically raised by a single mom. And I remember a very unique moment in time where my brother and I were carrying my dad up and down the stairs because we couldn't afford to build a ramp, right? Like we had to physically carry him up and down the front steps. our neighbor came by and said, "Hey, why don't you have a ramp?" And it was because we couldn't afford one. So him and his buddies came by and built one for us. So I've always just gravitated towards service in the community. I've always gravitated towards helping other people. And when it comes to politics, to me, there's a clear path in terms of who is trying to get people access to healthcare and opportunities and economic access, and who wasn't. So it was never about political party for me. It was just about trying to find people who would help other folks as well. And that's kind of how I got to where I am today.
Now, Senator, how old were you when your father got into a car accident?
I was 7 years old. So I was 7 years old when that happened. And I was actually the one that found him. It was a tragic incident where, he was working on a car and something went awry. So I was the one that found him during his car accident. And I was the one that found him when he eventually passed away years later because of it. And what was interesting, and this is maybe too much information, but he was 43. When it happened, he was 43 and I was 7. And I've always had that age in my mind. I'm 37 right now. So, you'll oftentimes in the media or in my campaign, I tend to overdo things. Like I work full time at Microsoft. I'm a state legislator. I'm very aggressive at it. I'm also running for office. I have 3 kids, and people always say, like, "Why are you doing so much? Like, how can you do so much?" And it's like, well, first off, that's our background. We've been working this hard for our entire lives, meaning our Vietnamese community. But also for me, I don't tell many people this, but like I feel very lucky just to be here. And in my mind, 43 years old is like I could be done at 43,
Yeah.
right? Like anything could happen to us at any time. So I've always thought that like I need to get all these things done before I got to the age of 43. It was because that's when my dad got into his car accident. So I know that it's not rational. I know that that's not, necessarily indicative of anything, but for some reason, getting things done before 43 has always been kind of in my mind.
Yeah, it's left an indelible mark in your memory and formed who you are today.
Yeah. Yeah.
What? So at 7, I mean, you discover your father like that, and now you're living with this person who's unable to do anything. And are you the oldest one? You the youngest one?
Oh yeah, there's 4 kids in my family. So my sister was also a refugee. So she's 13 years older than me and generally older than the rest of us. So my older sister came over as well. My older brother, myself, and my younger sister were all born here. So there's a little bit of a age gap. So there was 4 of us. But yeah, I mean, like a lot of people who came over at that time, my mom, especially as a single mom now, had to work a lot, multiple jobs, long hours. So my sister basically helped raise us, and all of us had to pitch in super early, right? So I started working probably maybe a few months before it was probably legal in the United States.
Yeah.
And I worked at the IMAX theater. I was a janitor at my high school. I took care of my little sister. And then even as we got a little bit older, it was still kind of financially difficult. So like my brother was going to go through med school. My sister was going through college. I had just graduated. So I financially helped my siblings. When I graduated from college, I wanted to say thank you to my mom. So I bought her a car because she'd been driving the same, Honda Accord since 1990. So, it's one of those things where it really takes all of us to be successful. And now, we're doing fine, right? So like, you're Vietnamese. The same things that I was probably told was you got to be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. So my brother's a doctor, my sister's an engineer, my other sister's an IT consultant. So I'm kind of the black sheep. I got into politics, but it takes all of us to be successful. And it's so funny that people say, "Oh, you work so hard," or like, "Why do you do so much?" This was normal for us, right? Like we've always had to work multiple jobs. We've always had to,
Yeah.
do things that we didn't want to. Like I didn't want to be a janitor while I was in high
Yeah.
school. You survive, and that's kind of what you got to do.
And was your father mentally able to sort of function, or it was the
No.
lights out after that?
Yeah, he was functionally brain damaged
Ah,
and physically incapacitated as well. My mom is very, very Catholic. She's very,
yeah.
very Catholic. So she did not want to pull the plug. So I grew up, during lunchtime in high school, I would sneak home, change him, feed him, and then come back to school. We would take turns doing that. I was his caregiver, right? So my brother and sister, my sister had to go to college locally to help. My brother went to school outside of Washington State. I stayed to help take care of my father because his health deteriorated at that point as well. So our whole life was revolved around that. And we had him in, supportive housing for a little bit, but he needed much more care than I think was possible. So we had a makeshift nursing home in our basement. So I was his official caretaker. Um, yeah, and imagine, being a 10-year-old kid growing up, having to change your parents'
Yeah.
diapers, showering him, in the makeshift shower in our bathroom, right? Like, and that just being a normal life. It was very humbling. It was very, very tough. Everybody, you know, I think the hard part is that in the Vietnamese culture is that we suppress a lot of this trauma. It doesn't ever get addressed. So I'll be honest, it was very, very tough for me growing up because my life was a bit different than other people's, but at the same time, you desperately wanted to fit in. And I desperately wanted to be just like the other kids, but we weren't, right? Like, um, so I don't know. I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so involved in the community and in politics now, is because I saw how hard it was for my family. And I know that it was nobody's fault, right? Like it could have happened to
Yeah.
anybody.
Yeah.
And being able to provide that type of support, especially to this community that gave me so much, is where I want to be able to serve, right? So like I'm a senator now in the area where I was born and raised. So I was born in White Center, raised in Burien, live in what's called West Seattle in this area, and that's where I'm the senator. And and I work, probably more than I should, is because my story, despite how sad it is not unique. There's a lot of us that experience this kind of trauma and pain that need help. And if I can help the next whatever Joe Nguyen, that's a big victory in my book.
Yeah. You know, as I listen to your story with your father, I can't help but think of all of the gifts, perhaps, that I'm just trying to make sense of it all, that he's left for you and your siblings. Because had you not had that, misfortune with your father, maybe things would have been different, where you're more well off and you're spoiled and you didn't have the sort of drive to take care of your family, and your perspective is not it wouldn't have come out, well, for sure wouldn't have come out the way that you and your siblings have come out today. So it's almost like a gift that was left behind by your father to sort of usher in a new way of being for the four of you, right?
Yeah, I feel like things happen for a reason. And I had to deal with that, when I was growing up, just because I was an angry kid. I'll be honest with you. I was an angry kid. I've always done well in school, but I always got into disciplinary issues. And I think it was a lot of it is because of that experience.
Hmm.
And again, I wouldn't wish that upbringing on anybody. But what was very, I don't know, fortuitous, I guess, is that when we went back to Vietnam and after his funeral, again, in the Vietnamese community, you don't talk about these things very much, and I didn't know much about him, right? So from 7 years old to when he passed away, I didn't really know anything about his past. And it wasn't until his funeral that I talked to his best friends, growing up, and like hearing the stories of his work in the community and hearing kind of how much he gave back. And even the car that he was working on that ended up causing the accident, he was trying to fix up this old van so that he can help drive people who couldn't drive, elderly people who didn't have a license to church, right? So like he was a community
Wow.
advocate. He helped build the community. So I think it's funny being able to see, people talk about how like I'm very similar to my dad in that respect, even though I didn't know him, right? So his legacy for me lives on in the work that we do as well.
I am hearing progressive, and I'm hearing, all of these things about the Vietnamese community. Not, there's a big Republican, demographic, and
Yeah.
sometimes, I have a lot of family, obviously, because we're Vietnamese on the Republican side, and my brother and I, we're very, we lean left. And I sometimes, and I think that it's a formula, right? It's sort of like, can we debate? What I've realized is, like, can we just debate on the things that we're given or the things that we want to give away, right? I think that at the end of the day, that's what represents the political nature of our debates. It's like, okay, well, if you're on one side, you kind of want to hold on to what you have. And if you're on the other side, you kind of want to give it away to help society, right? But I feel like today that's not sort of what we're debating anymore. We're debating
No,
things that we can't even, and I can
it's
understand it if we're debating, hey, you want to keep that, I want to give this away. We can get to a truth of, but that's not what's going on anymore, is it?
no, and you're right. And what's funny is I never really understood it until I started working in what's called adverse childhood experiences, trying to understand like the root causes of, say, for instance, poverty and stuff like that. And there's a study called brain science where we've known that people who experience what's called adverse childhood experiences or trauma oftentimes will have outcomes in their lives that are not necessarily positive, whether it's drug dependencies, whether it's domestic abuse, stuff like that. And what's interesting is that we've seen in our communities a lot of trauma. And I think because of that, people react certain ways. And one of it is that they have a visceral reaction towards government, right? Like because of the regime that caused the
Right.
pain and harm that they felt. So whether it's emotional, whether it is real or not, I think that informs a lot of the perspectives. And what's interesting is you look at the programs in place that help our communities, that helped our communities when we were here. They're not conservative values by any means. So it's
That's
interesting to
the
see.
irony.
Yeah, that's the irony, right? So, like, we rail against, well, not we, but like our more conservative elders rail against, immigrants. And it's like, you do realize that if it was us coming right now, you'd be railing against us, right? So, I don't fault them for it. It's part of their lived experience. I've tried to figure out how do you bridge that gap, and it's very tough. But what I have been heartened by is that at least in the local community, there's a progressive group of Vietnamese people, younger generation of folks who are now kind of getting into power, now who understand that we aren't just guests here in the United States anymore. We are, in fact, Americans, and our voices deserve to be heard as well. So seeing that transition has been positive. And we respect and will always include our elders, but at the same time, we shouldn't be held back by it as well.
When did you have this inkling or this seed of politics in your mind?
Yeah. I'll be honest. I mean, I ran for class president when I was in high school. And that wasn't like, I wouldn't think that I was going to run for anything else besides that. But what's funny is that when I ran for class president as a freshman, my mom told me not to run, right? She said, no, that's a waste of time. You should just be studying and doing your homework. Why are you going to waste your time doing this stuff? But I ran anyway and I won. And I was too scared to tell her because of it. And then I did it again. So I was class president for 3 years. And then when I got to college, I ran for student body president as a junior, which is rare. Most of the time, student body presidents are seniors and they're been involved in student government. And I wasn't. Same thing. Said, don't run. You should focus on your school. You need to get a job afterwards, and you will have less time to find a job if you're doing that kind of stuff. Did it anyway, and I won, and it was great. And she was supportive. And then I had always been involved in the community, but what's interesting is that despite being the most populous last name, so our name Nguyen is the most popular name in King County, which is the biggest county in Washington State. Nobody had ever seen our name on a ballot before, so there's not really been an example of Vietnamese leaders at that level. There's only a handful of local electeds who are Vietnamese that were recently elected when I ran. And then when I became a senator, I was the very first Vietnamese state senator in Washington State. And then there was another representative who was also Vietnamese that we became the first legislators of Vietnamese descent in the legislature. So I think part of it was that since we've had no examples of what leadership looks like at that capacity, it's hard to see yourself in leadership. So I wasn't thinking about running for office until about maybe 5 years ago at this point. And it was because a young man named Tommy Lay was shot by law enforcement in Burien, where I grew up, about a block from where I went to high school. And it was one of those weird things where you go through the motions, you read the news articles, and it says man with knife lunges at cop and cop shoots him, and you're like, okay, yeah, that person deserved to die. First off, nobody deserves to die, but like, yeah, I can see how that happened. And then I hear from his family, and then I hear from the community, and I get text messages from folks, and it's like, hey, that was actually Tommy. He's from the Vietnamese community, and he wasn't holding a knife. Maybe it was a pen, even though we didn't see a pen, right? Like, there were all these inconsistencies in the story, and it comes out that, like, look, first off, that shouldn't have happened in the first place. That, and like our communities has been experiencing this trauma and didn't know how to navigate forward. So I worked with his family to help organize some forums, some engagement with law enforcement, some politicians as well, and got involved in that respect. And through that, I had been working around housing and homelessness, and just realized that, look, we just need leaders who reflect the values of the community and who will fight for the issues that we care about. And that wasn't quite happening. I'll be honest, I would go to some of these meetings, I would talk to my local elected official who was in charge of all these things. And it's one thing for them not to know kind of like that particular issue, but there's another when you can tell that they're not really tracking. Like, I don't know if they actually cared. So I got frustrated and I decided to run for office. And when I ran against 10 other people. So there was 11 of us in this race. I was told I wasn't going to win because I wasn't going to raise enough money. I didn't have any support. And because of that, I had no shot, which honestly is stuff that I've been told my entire life, is that I would not have a shot because I was young, I was poor, I was a person of color, I was an immigrant, I was a refugee. So, we proved them wrong. Won by a landslide in a race where we were outspent 5-1, 4-1, I think is what it was. And then after that was told that, yeah, you're not going to be able to be successful as a legislator because you don't understand this system, nor do you have the relationships. I'm in leadership now in the Senate, right? Like, we negotiated some of the biggest bills in Washington state. So it's funny that like every single step of my life, I've been told that I wasn't going to be good enough. And then just because I did it, I seem to be doing fine. So through that experience, it's always kind of interesting to see who gets told they're good enough and who gets told that they're not. And because of my experiences growing up being told that I wasn't, I didn't think that I was going to run for office until I actually did it. And when I did it, I had to make sure that I was going to do well, because then it's going to reflect on other people as well.
But how do you know, in grade school and high school that you run? Like, what is inside of you that's telling you that you can run and there's a potential to win? Because
Yeah.
there's a certain confidence of
Yeah.
somebody who does that, right?
Yeah, no, that's fair. And I honestly think it's because I'm a middle child, and like my older sister was like the valedictorian of her school. My brother was a valedictorian of his school. So like I was never going to compete with them when it came to academics. I did fine. I mean, I probably could have been if I tried harder, but like, I think I was just trying to find my space in this world. And I was of the generation where I was old enough to understand that we belonged here, but I was still naive and young enough that I wasn't just bought in towards what I was being told. Right. So I think a lot of it was the fact that I was kind of, I saw how much adversity we've gone through, and I saw how hard we had to work, and I didn't really see it systemically in other people. So even when I ran for, freshman class president, the person that I ran against was popular, right? So the school that I went to had feeder schools that would go to it. So this person already knew a lot of people. But at the same time, I was like, well, I'm looking at the popular kids, and they sit at this table during lunch, and there's only about 20 of them. But everybody else, there's like 300 of everybody else. So for me, I'm like, I don't need to be popular. I just need people to vote for me. And I think I need to reflect what they want. Right. So it's always been kind of this weird dynamic where I see things that I think are problems. And then I hear what people say, is impossible, but I don't think that they are. So it's almost like a chip on my shoulder type of scenario, I think, where, the combination of being, middle child, having a chip on your shoulder, having to survive a lot of things that most people wouldn't even be able to imagine. So when I started doing the public stuff, first off, I wanted to challenge myself, but also I just wanted to prove people wrong. I was tired of being told that I wasn't going to be good enough, and candidly, they were wrong, right? So I think that challenge was kind of what motivated me, and then knowing that I can help people, I thought was also important as well.
But coming out of college, you have to find a job, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So out of college, I worked in finance actually. So worked in finance, and then worked in tech afterwards as well. And then I still work at Microsoft in tech. But I've always wanted to help people. And what's interesting is that I had a pretty good career right out of college. Most college students don't quite get that opportunity. But I was working in a field in finance that was lucrative, but also it shifted my paradigm of how things worked, right? So I went from being like very poor to now working with probably some of the wealthiest people to live in Washington State, managing, like $300 million on behalf of all these different people. And it was fine. I just never felt at home. And it wasn't until my dad passed away and we went back to Vietnam to bury him with his family did I meet my extended relatives in Vietnam. And they live in a legit village. It's still a village in Phan Rang, just south of Nha Trang. And like, dirt floors, you're eating on the ground. There is no
Yep.
table. Flies are everywhere. But despite, their humble nature, they were very generous. They would feed us. They would give us the room with the AC. They would do all these very kind things. Um, People that had nothing, but willing to give up, everything they had to make you feel welcomed. And that kind of put me over the edge, right? So like I was working with literally millionaires and billionaires, and it was stressful. I'd get phone calls when the market would go down a little bit, and they'd like get mad that they lost some money, even though they were billionaires, right? Like, so you go that contrast and you see regular people and you're like, where do I find life? Where do I find joy in its service to people? And the fact that there are people who have nothing who are willing to give back, that means I should give back as well. So changed my career path a little bit, went more into the tech space, gave myself some more time because I was working probably 90 hours a week at that point. So going into tech gave me the opportunity to basically free up my time to work in the community and also work at the same time. And that's kind of how I got more involved.
What was that was your first trip to Vietnam, that
Yeah,
fun run?
for my father's funeral. Yeah, so I was like 22, I think 23, can't remember exact age. Yeah, so it was right after college. So what's interesting is that he got into his car accident when I was in the first grade, so when I was 7, and then he was quadriplegic and brain dead for most of my life, and then finally passed away because of the pneumonia and other ailments kind of took him. And that was the first time I went back to Vietnam, and that was the first time I kind of heard and saw all the stories and saw where they grew up and realized my mom didn't even talk to us about some of the things, right? Like she used to sell fish sauce and would hitchhike up this road, a couple of hours a day, sell fish sauce. And that's how they made her money. Or like she would make fishing nets, right? And like would point
Wow.
out to all these spots. And we would just drive towards random places in Vietnam. And she would say a story, right? Like this is where, XYZ happened. This is where I helped this. And it's just these amazing stories that we have in our communities that we don't ever talk about. And we should, because they're heroic. They are absolutely heroic.
At what point um, do you, after the Tommy incident, do you say to yourself, okay, I'm going to really get involved fully into politics?
Yeah, I think it was after the community event that we had where we brought together community leaders and public officials and stuff like that. Um, that I just got a little bit frustrated, right? Like we were not able to make our voices be heard, is kind of how I felt. And I just felt that the system was not working. So it was probably 8 to 9 months after that incident, I joined what's called the Office of Law Enforcement Oversight in King County and served in that space in an official capacity for a little while as well. That I got more ingrained. And it's kind of one of those things where on the outside, it looks very difficult to get into, right? Like, oh, I don't know anybody in there. I'm not sure how this works. So you feel like you don't belong. And the more I got involved in that space, the more I realized that, hey, this spot is kind of broken, if I'm honest. And how do I go about fixing it? And kind of, success is a combination of skill and luck. Um, and I was thinking about running for office. And a few months after I was thinking about running for office, the senator in my area decided to retire. So what's interesting is that the opportunity popped up and decided to run. I was thinking about running for office right away. I was more thinking like in general, maybe one day I'd run for office. And then the opportunity presented itself. So I threw my name in the hat and I ran because of it as well.
Now, when you say that office that you sort of got involved in was broken, what do you mean by broken?
Yeah, so here's a good example. If you look at the way politics works at the legislature, in our legislature, we see about 3 or 4 thousand bills in any given year, 3 or 4 thousand bills. Yet we only pass maybe 2 to 300. So people think that politics is about right or wrong, Democrats, Republicans, progressives, or not. That's actually not the case. It's making sure that your issue is worthy of being discussed. It has to be prioritized. And oftentimes, when you look at systems that require people in power, the people in power are going to perpetuate the system that put them in power. So it's the issues that their friends care about, that they care about. It's issues that their donors care about. So when you talk about things like basic needs programs or police accountability or whatever, that don't have expensive lobbyists fighting for things, your issue oftentimes doesn't get prioritized. So I felt that was fundamentally the broken piece. And oftentimes when you'll see elected officials talk about community engagement, they'll make a decision on behalf of the community and then tell them after the decision is being made. And that to them is community engagement. And if you're lucky, they may do it in multiple languages, right? But to me, you need to be talking within the community. You need to be having these dialogues and relationships before a problem happens. So it was broken, but it was on purpose. So maybe broken is probably not the right word. It was working according to plan. And if you benefited from that system, it worked for you. But if you were not in that system, like me and the communities that I cared about, it didn't work for you. So that's kind of why I wanted to get involved, was because I thought we needed more access to basic needs programs. I thought we needed more affordable housing. We need to address homelessness. We need to do all these different things that we weren't doing. So decided to jump in, and luckily the people in my district agreed with me, and we were able to win, pretty handedly, despite, having a lot of things going against us from the political establishment.
So you have these issues that you want to get resolved, but there's like 3,000 to 4,000 pieces of these bills floating around. How is it that the mathematics in your head going, there's 3,000 or 4,000 of these things floating around, 200 to 300 get passed.
Yeah.
How do you make sure that your stuff gets up there?
Yeah, no, so what's funny is I'm a program manager by training. So I love this stuff. I love process. I'll just put that out there. So you hit on like a good chord for me. Right after I won my election, I sat down and I documented every single step to passing legislation in Washington State. And there's about 153 steps, right? So it's pretty nuanced. Everything from where do you get the idea from? How do you get it to a committee? How do you get it out of committee? All these different things. So there's about 153 steps towards getting a bill passed. And of that, a third of them, that's when a bill can die. So I documented the entire process, and I noticed where there were some key leverage points. So for instance, as a first year member, I advocated to be on a committee called Rules. The Rules Committee is probably the most powerful committee that nobody knows about. They're the ones that get to pick what gets to the floor. So as a first year member, I said, hey, I want to be on the Rules Committee. And usually they tell you no. But because I showed that I was, savvy and engaged and I deserved to be on that committee, I was the only first year member to be on that committee, which nobody even knows about. So that's how you make sure that your issue is being discussed. Is not only do you need to champion it, you have to do the work, right? And like one of the work is making sure that after it gets through committee, it gets to the floor. It gets to the floor, it has enough votes. I also know that the things that I care about cost money. So if I want to expand funding for basic needs programs like TANF or more affordable housing, you have to pay for it. So I got very involved in advocating and drafting policies that got more revenue for the state in an equitable way. And because of that, then you get a lot of leeway as well. So a lot of it in terms of the math, in terms of how do you get this stuff done, is showing up and doing the work, right? Like as a senator, there's no like guidebook in terms of how to do things.
Right.
You can do whatever you want. You can use your office as a bully pulpit. So I just said, look, I don't care what the rules are because this system wasn't built for me. I'm just going to do what I think is right. And so far, nobody's really stopped me, right? And like you just keep moving forward. And it reminds me of just growing up where you see a problem, you fix a problem. You see a problem, you fix a problem. And people respect that. So even as one of the more progressive members in the legislature, right after I announced that I was running, a moderate conservative reporter tweeted out something that said, hey, look, despite being progressive, he's actually very well liked by the Republican Party because he's honest, he's straightforward, and he gets things done. And what's interesting is that in Washington State, the number of bills that are bipartisan in Washington State, 93%. So 93% of the bills that we pass are bipartisan. So people think that it's divisive all the time. It doesn't actually have to be divisive. It's a matter of just sitting down and doing the work. So I think they appreciated that I got work done. So when you have these relationships, when you have these conversations, when you figure out how the process works, when you understand what community wants, when you understand, what the opposition might be, that's how you get some of these things done. And that's why I think, we were able to be successful. And it's also not an accident, right? So there are definitely people who've been working very hard in this space on a number of issues that we push for this year. But it's also not an accident that this is the most diverse legislature in the history of Washington state, the most diverse by far. And we're passing some of the most transformative policies. It's because you have people who are now at the table that are impacted by these policies, and now they're advocating for it, right? So like childcare, right? Affordable housing, rent issues, tenant protections, all those things where nobody was being able to champion it because nobody had that experience. We even have a representative who is a formerly incarcerated individual. She had a felony drug conviction, and after she was released, went to law school, fought to get her bar exam approved by the Supreme Court, ran for office, now is championing criminal justice reform, right? Like that's how you get stuff done. Is you get people who show up and do the work.
You know, I'm a layman when it comes to politics. I don't, know the intricacies of it. But when I have these sort of like these fantasies of like what a politician in my mind looks like, it's some guy wearing a cowboy hat or, just lounging with a big cigar and, not really having to do the work. It's just his presence, his image of being in the location, in the setting, sets the tempo or the pace for things being passed. Now, I know that's a complete fantasy the way I've just described that. But how much of that is true, where there's this sort of like this power player just shows up and sort of wields his magic wand and, makes things happen? Or is it really a lot of these guys rolling up their sleeves and doing the work?
Well, it's kind of like the Wizard of Oz, if I'm honest. What's funny is that when I was first elected, I think for the first 3 months in the legislature, people thought that I was staff. So like people would see me and they'd say, "Oh, who do you work for? Are you somebody's LA? Are you staff?" And I'm like, "Oh no, I'm Joe Nguyen. I'm the senator." Right. And like, I even thought about changing the way that I dress because I'm, casual when it comes to how I dress. It was still in a suit and whatnot. And I was like, oh, maybe I should dress up more. Maybe I should have a different type of personality and stuff. And I was like, you know what? I'm not doing that because I think what leadership looks like is going to be different going forward. And that wouldn't be authentic of me. My wife actually got mad at me a couple of times because I'd wear like a hoodie around the Capitol building. And she was like, what are you doing? You were a senator. Stop wearing a hoodie. But I'm like, it's comfortable. So, like you have to be authentically yourself. You have to change the paradigm of what it looks like to be in leadership. But at the same time, those dynamics definitely exist, right? Like there are certainly dynamics where because somebody is older white guy, like they get treated differently than me, right? Like there are times where we deal with microaggressions and people say things that are problematic to me that is just normal. But if I were to ever speak up, it would be unheard of, right? So one of the first things that happens when you're in the Senate is that your first speech, usually people will joke. There's always like kind of a roast, right? Like people joked about me being young, me working in tech and all that stuff. And then there was one of the members who made fun of our last name and was like, I don't know how you get Nguyen from Nagayan. You should say it different. And like went on just a little bit too long. You know what I mean? Like there's one thing to joke about your name. There's another to like be derogatory about it. And that was just normal for folks. And it blew up and it was covered, nationally as well. But like, that's the stuff that we have to deal with. And I remember even one time I just made a comment that was like, hey, as one of the few people of color in the room, please don't talk over me, right? Like oftentimes people notice that like supporting communities of color is now politically popular. And they'll say that they know more about what is racially just for, say, for instance, the Asian community than me, right? So it's like, I'm here now, like, let's calm it down. And there was pushback. People were frustrated. They wanted to be able to say that they cared more about Asians than I did as an Asian person. So it's a weird dynamic where, there's certainly a perception that still exists in the legislature of what a senator should look like. We're trying to break that down. But that paradigm is hard. And I think that actually leads to a lot of the anti-Asian hate that we're seeing recently too, is that because our experiences have been minimized for so long, that people don't see us as leaders, they don't humanize our experiences. That has caused some of the problems that we're seeing.
Speaking of humanizing, I find that you being a senator and working still for Microsoft, very not human. That's superhuman. And how do you balance that? How do you juggle that?
It is. My mental health is probably not great. I also don't sleep very much too, which is probably not a very good thing. And even then, if it was just being in the legislature and working full time at Microsoft, I could probably do it just fine. Again, because I'm used to working like 90 hours a week, which is not healthy and I wouldn't recommend it. I also have 3 kids. So I have a beautiful family that I love and adore. But again, it kind of reminds me of when I was a kid where, yeah, you got to be a janitor during school and then you got to work on the weekends and you got to help make ends meet at home because there's no other option. And for me, at this moment in time right now, whether it's the pandemic, whether there's racial inequities, whether there's police accountability issues, I truly do feel that like people's lives are at stake. And for me, the reason why I push it harder than I probably should is because I know that there are people who made sacrifices on my behalf, and I'm obligated to give back. But yeah, you're right. It doesn't make sense working multiple jobs and doing everything.
I never knew that, senators had to have other jobs. I thought that would be your full-time job.
Yeah, in California is different. In California, you do have a full-time legislator with staff and a livable wage. So I get paid $47,000 a year as a senator. And where I live in Seattle, that wouldn't be sufficient to raise a family of 3. So yeah, what ends up happening is that you'll have legislators who are generally wealthier, older because they're retired, and oftentimes white, and most of the times men, right? So I think when I came into the legislature, me and one other person, we were in our 30s. So we brought down the average age of the Senate by like 20 years, I think, right? So like just because most of the people that I work with are 70 years old, maybe they're 55 older. So like it's funny, whenever I talk to elementary school students or high school students, I'll say, hey, look, I'm actually closer in age to you than I am to most of the people that I work with. And the reason why that's important is because the legislation that we're passing impacts our lives and your life and your future. It doesn't impact the people who are there right now. So that's part of the problem, right? So like if people think politics is broken, it's because it's really hard to run for office. It's really hard to be in this position. Even after you win, it's tough. I've basically had to sacrifice my career at Microsoft. So like I show up and I do work, but like, I'm probably not going to get like a huge promotion anytime soon because I'm just doing enough to make sure that I'm, giving back to the company, but also having to balance that time with the legislature as well.
But doesn't the quality of your work in the legislature suffer as a result of not, like in California, if it's, you're full time, you don't get to spend, it's not like an all-in approach, right?
Yeah.
How does that affect the quality of the product of what you're putting out?
Yeah. I mean, that's why I work, probably 80, 90 hours a week is because I'm trying to do both as best as I can. And I'll be honest, a lot of folks, they they don't put in the same amount of time, and it's not their fault. That's just the way that the system is built. But you're right. Um, One of the reasons why we're able to pass legislation and get things through was because we put in the time and the effort. Not everybody has that privilege, and I don't fault them for it. It's because they do have other things going on in their lives as well. So you'll oftentimes see bills get rushed. You'll also oftentimes see things kind of, not be perfect. And it's because we don't have the sufficient amount of time to actually think these things through. But yeah, so for me, I mean, that's why I have to do both. That's why I do both aggressively, as you're right. It makes it very, very difficult to have a good legislative product when the people who are in charge of it have a hard time being there financially, because they can't afford to, or the people who are there and aren't invested in certain types of change, right? So like if you have no renters, if only the people who are in the legislature owned property, it's going to be very hard to have tenant protection, right? Like if you have people who don't need childcare because that's been so far removed from them, it's going to be a hard time convincing folks that childcare is important, right? So it's being able to have those experiences that I think makes the whole process better, but the process makes it tough for people who are younger, people of color, moms, women, or whatever, parents, young parents, to get involved.
Can we talk about the evolution of a bill and how
Yeah.
it moves along? Because like I have an idea and I want this to be passed into a law. From that idea to it being enforced on the street, like how does it move through?
Yeah, it's super interesting, right? So oftentimes you'll have an idea, and that comes from either yourself because you're involved in that process. So there's a few different types of legislators. There are legislators who they have a particular lane that they care about, and that's all they work on, whether it's criminal justice, whether it's behavioral health, environmental issues, tech issues, whatever. That's what they do. So they either have an idea, or they have stakeholders or advocates that have an idea of a problem that they're trying to solve or something that they're trying to accomplish. So that's how it starts. Ideas come from a variety of places. From there, you work with staff to kind of figure out, okay, well, this is the problem we're trying to solve. How do we actually figure it out? And most often, staff will help craft legislation. So there's probably a few legislators who write bills themselves because they are the subject matter experts in a particular space. I don't write most of my bills. I'll write some of the tech bills because my background happens to be in tech. So from there, you draft the bill itself. And that's the early concepts of that bill. And you can do it a variety of different ways. Sometimes people just go from there and they try to get it through the process and have a committee hearing and go through. What I try to do is have some of the conversations early before I even introduce the bill, because I want to understand how it impacts other people. I want to understand the potential ramifications associated with it. And if you have these conversations up front, you're less likely to get people pushing back on you.
Right.
So from there, you have an idea, you meet with people who agree with you. And this is the key, you meet with people who also don't agree with you. And then you get feedback. And based off of that feedback, you refine it. And then from there, you go to the legislature, you introduce the bill, it gets heard in committee, you have an opportunity for public feedback. You then have to go and get a vote. You vote in the Senate, in my case, and now you got to start it all over again in the House. And in the House, the hard part is that you don't control the House, at least from my perspective as a senator. So you need to have relationships built over there. People need to understand what the bill does or what it doesn't do. I would say that the vast majority of my time is just spent explaining to people what the bill does or does not do. You're not trying to like help educate them so much as you're just like, okay, this is what it does, and this is what it doesn't do. And then you kind of get it through the process, and then the governor signs it. And what's interesting is after a bill becomes a law, that's only half the battle,
Right.
because you have to implement the bill as well. And most of the times, the language in laws will say, like, this department has to come up with a plan to figure this out. So then you also have to work with different agencies or task force or work groups to figure something out before it then becomes implemented. So is this whole thing that you have to do. And that's why change is so hard in this current system, is because the process itself is a very cumbersome, but also if it's trying to change something that's broken, it's oftentimes broken because somebody's benefiting from it, right? Like, as the person who sits as the vice chair of human services and reentry and rehabilitation, my job is to figure out how do we humanely get people out of prisons and back into society. But honestly, it's, profitable for some companies to keep people in prisons. So you fight these dynamics all the time as you're working through this process. And that's kind of how it works. And it's always constantly evolving.
Senator, when I think of that very paradigm, I think of how evil it actually is.
Yeah.
It's just pure evil to incarcerate human beings,
Yeah.
keep them in there for money, for profit. How is this even possible?
Well, if you look at our society, so back in the 70s and 80s, we used to spend the same amount of money on human services and basic needs programs as we did on our criminal justice system, the same. So because of the war on drugs, we ended up, instead of trying to solve for the root causes of poverty, we started criminalizing poverty to the point where we spend 4 times as much minimum on criminal justice as we do on human services to alleviate these issues. It's very clearly manifesting itself too in my area in King County, where the general fund, so the budget that the King County Council in my area passes, 73% of that budget goes towards the criminal justice system. 73%. So we're basically raising taxes on people to pay for a prison system to incarcerate people for things that are because they are too poor to live. This whole thing is broken, and it's hard to fix because oftentimes the people who are in charge of that system are benefiting from it, or their donors benefit from it. So, and that's why I decided to run for office, to fix these things, is because we have to. I don't understand why we don't do it. Like nobody should be happy with spending 73% of your budget on something that is preventable.
But is it going to be fixed? Do you think that the possibility of getting this really cleaned up, this whole idea of cumbersome,
Yeah.
can you really gut it out and redo this?
Yeah, I think honestly, what people don't realize is that it doesn't take an army to change an entire system. You take a couple of people in the right spots and you can really reform it. But it's hard because right now I'm fighting against an institution trying to keep it the same, right? Like for me, I think if you had 5 or 6 people in the right spots in Washington State, at least you can make some transformative change because then you have leaders who don't care about how the process used to work. They're just focused on how do you get things done. And what I've noticed is that there are definitely people who realize that they should be doing something. So they'll create a study, they'll do a press conference about something, they'll have a photo op showing how much they care about our communities. But then that's it, they don't actually follow up. So for me, I think what's important is to have people who reflect the future of our democracy, who will roll up their sleeves and get the work done, in charge to actually make it happen. We've already seen it starting to happen in the legislature. Like I mentioned, this past year was probably one of the most consequential legislative sessions in the history of Washington State. We funded things to help mitigate poverty. We will put money towards behavioral health, substance use disorder, all these different things to address root causes of poverty. And a lot of that was because of the people who are there fought hard to make sure that that happened as well. And I think if we did that, more systemically at the county level or otherwise, we can truly make some change.
Senator, all of this sounds very logical. For me, for you, it just sounds the right thing to do, right?
Yeah.
We're kind of in our own echo chamber. I talked to members of Pivot, which is a Vietnamese
Yeah. Yeah.
progressive. And I always say to whoever I'm sitting with in the interview, I'm saying, we understand this. We, as members of sort of this progressive idea, we get it, but we're in our own echo chamber. How do we get people across the aisle, not just our Vietnamese, but everyone, to kind of understand these very simple, logical things that in order to, improve society, you have to allocate funds to the mental health and yada, yada, and you'll eliminate the homelessness problem. And these are things that are sort of self-evident to us.
Yeah.
How do we get people on the other side to kind of understand it? Or do we not? Because there's a lot of forces that are profiting from this stuff, and that's the real battle. It's not really the constituents, but it's the people who are making it sort of cumbersome on the system.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of answers there, right? So, like I said before, 93% of the bills in Washington State were in fact bipartisan. So I would say that the local politics is very different than the national politics. That's a completely different game to play. But here locally, I think one of the biggest things is that people just want to know that you're listening to their issues and you're working to solve them, right? So the reason why I have good relationships with people who disagree with me is because I will show up and have these honest and oftentimes tough conversations. And that sounds very mundane, but it's true. I've definitely had success before on legislation that people thought would be very controversial, but because I talked to the people who would be impacted by it, who may not necessarily agree, we were able to come to a resolution that actually helped. So I think it is possible to get people on board. The hard part that we have sometimes is that it's easy to vilify people when you don't know them very well. You don't humanize each other's experiences. So I think part of it is becoming uncomfortable, having these tough conversations, but also being transparent and being like, hey, look, I just don't agree. We're just going to move forward. So that's also the other piece too, is that we can try as hard as we can to be bipartisan, but like we also need to know when to leave the station if the train's got to go. So right. That's part of it. And I think, you'd be surprised at how much success you can have simply by showing up, simply by listening, simply by making sure that the policies you implement are mindful of somebody else's experience.
Can we talk about something that you've moved along? And I'm just going to bring this up because I think it's something that I can ask questions and sort of logically kind of figure out. This idea of facial recognition.
Yeah.
Can we use that as an example, case study of you moving along and you having that idea of why you approached that particular topic and moved it along?
Yeah, first off, it's because I thought it was an incredibly important one where it was impacting our communities in a negative way. And it was impacting our communities in a negative way, but it became very polarized in terms of politics. And I was kind of frustrated with seeing people kind of use it, not because they wanted to actually address systemic problems, but because it became like a political tool, that the people who would be impacted by it were communities that I cared about. So my first bill that I had in the legislature as it relates to facial recognition was actually, I was co-sponsoring a bill with one of the other senators to basically ban facial recognition. And that was kind of where we started off. And obviously not everybody agrees that that was the case. And in fact, doing more research kind of shows that, like, look, our phones have facial recognition, our computers have facial recognition. When I take a photo of my kids, it's stored and categorized using facial recognition. So it wasn't all bad. So then I set out to say, okay, cool. What is it that we think is bad that we want to at the very least mitigate? And it was like, okay, well, we don't want it to be used disproportionately on communities of color. We don't want it to be used to accelerate a broken justice system. We don't want it to be used on mass protests to try to pick apart people, right? So I started gravitating away from like banning the technology altogether, because there were some good purposes to try to mitigate and regulate the things that could cause the most amount of harm. And that was a very, very tough bill to pass, because it was one of those things where if you were too progressive, you couldn't get the votes, because then, there are people that were more moderate that understood that this actually had value, wouldn't vote for it. And there were, if you get too moderate, then you get other folks who didn't want to vote for it. So it was hard. And also the other part was that this is a technology that not everybody's comfortable with, let alone folks who are potentially older, who don't understand how technology works. So I wanted to work on that space because I thought it was important. I wanted to work on that space because I didn't think that we had the ability to fail, because it could be used, in our communities unnecessarily. And we found a path that I thought would make a lot of sense. So before, if a law enforcement agency was using it, nobody would know because they didn't have to report it. So now there has to be an accountability report. If the technology was biased, nobody would really know because there's no way to review it. So in the bill, you're required to have it be available for testing for potential bias as well. And then also in the bill, you have to have a court order if you were going to use it on an individual. So you can't just use it willy-nilly. You can't just go out and have facial recognition to everybody. You have to have a particular person that you're looking for, and it can only be matching for that particular positive instance. So we were able to address the root causes of what we thought was wrong with the technology. But say, for instance, the tribal communities came and they made a comment that said, hey, look, we have an issue with missing and murdered Indigenous women. We want to be able to use facial recognition to help find them.
Wow.
I was like, okay, cool. Well, I'm not gonna tell them no, right? Like, we can't ban it. So there were instances where people wanted to use it. We have what's called a silver alert in Washington State, where folks who are older, they have dementia, get lost. They wanted to be able to use facial recognition to find it, right? Like sex trafficking, right? Like human trafficking. They wanted to be able to use facial recognition to find it. Even more mundane things. So say, for instance, we had a problem with processing and identifying unemployment claims because you had to verify somebody's identity. If you were able to match their photo with their driver's license, you can automatically match them in an instant.
Right.
So we could have made government more efficient. That's how we use real ID, right? So like there were like even secured areas, right? So like there are areas where, whether it's military base or otherwise, they wanted to have facial recognition just to confirm that that person's supposed to be there. So there were all these instances where people needed to use it for good reason. And by the way, if you compare it with regular people, so if you were to have a human pick somebody out of a lineup, they're wrong about 40% of the times. If you use facial recognition, it's actually more accurate. If you use people who are trained in facial recognition, it's almost perfect. It's like 99.9%.
Wow.
So in the bill, it actually requires that if facial recognition is used, you then also have to be reviewed by a human. So we just took a problem that was very meaty and complex. I looked at every single piece of legislation in the world to see if it's an option, and then kind of worked through what that process looked like. And we ended up being able to pass it. And now it's like the most holistic bill as it relates to facial recognition, in at least in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, it's like so random to me. When I read it, I read how involved you were in it, and I'm like, how does an issue like that come across your table, and how does it get worked out? Anyway, all of it now aside, it's like we're all wearing masks. So is there, is that something that's still on the table? Is that still a problem for the United States?
I mean, I think yes, right? So like you see companies like Clearview AI that's like scraping photos and using it for purposes that we don't agree with, right? So the technology is still there, and we still need to be mindful of how it's used. I see it kind of like fire, right? Like there are good uses of fire and there are bad uses of fire. So we just have to be mindful of how it works. Yeah. But yeah, it came to my desk because it did have equity impacts. right? So I did know that communities that were very concerned about it, especially our, say, for instance, undocumented or Muslim communities, who have had it used against them in a negative way. And I wanted to stop that from happening.
What has been some of the most challenging things about your journey so far?
Um, I mean, from a legislative perspective, um, I mean, honestly, from a personal perspective, when you're a young person or a person of color, it's so funny. Like the whole process is kind of stacked against you, even though people say that it's not, right? So, like, you've probably seen people say, yeah, we need more young people and people of color running for office. And in the moment that you do it, oh, it's not your turn. You should wait in line. You're not ready yet. And then when you get there, everything is based on seniority. So it's like, well, if you're a young person or a person of color, you're not going to be in these senior positions. But then you work through it, right? So like it's this weird dynamic where you're always told that you're never going to be good enough. But then you also keep hearing people say that we need more of your voices. But then like when you get there, this whole system is out to get you. It's like this weird dynamic. So I think the mental strain is probably the hardest part, because I take this very personally because I'm helping people, right? So like when I see people do things, to attack me or people that I care about, I take it a little bit personal when I shouldn't, because it's just the way that politics is played. But at the same time, it's like this is why our community is having a hard time getting the resources and access that it needs, is because you got to run this gauntlet in order to get any help. Yet
Yeah.
other communities who've been there for a long time, it just happens, right? So it's like weird.
But it's what goes through my mind right now is this. It's what's when I hear what you're saying, it doesn't sound like it's the other side that's holding you back. It's people from within your own
Oh,
party. But you didn't make that distinction. But I'm hearing
yeah.
like, wait your turn or being having seniority. But then that doesn't mean that it's the other side that's telling you that
No.
within your own party line.
Well, not just own party, it could be your own family, it could be your own community, right? So like I was warned when I first ran for office that, hey, there are people who are not going to support you that you thought should, and there are people who are going to support you that you didn't think was going to happen. And that happens now. I'll be honest, I'm again one of the more progressive members of the legislature. I've probably had more Republicans ask me to run for office, even though they know my positions, than Democrats. Um, First off, because they probably want to muck things up a little bit, but also because they saw something in me that even I didn't see in me, um, because they've had to work with all these individuals before as well. So that's kind of a weird dynamic. But like one of the hardest communities to kind of get support from here was the Vietnamese community, because they were more conservative. They were like, are you like that socialist AOC? And I'm like, oh, wow, this is not going to end well. This conversation is not going to end well. So like that stuff happens.
When you get approached with questions like that, how do you answer it?
uh it's just, I don't think they want, I'm just like, here I'm here to help people. I don't think she helps people as well. So like I try not to engage too much, and I just like smile and shake their hands and like move on. But like it's, I had an uncle, this is probably one of the more telling experiences. I had an uncle who I've known my entire life. I've known my entire life. And he was like, I don't know who you are, why are you running? And I'm like, are you serious right now? Like are you being sarcastic, right? So like it was kind of funny seeing somebody who you've known your entire life. And again, we weren't like close, right? Like by any means, we don't, whatever. I knew that he was friends with my dad and he's hung out at the house, and I knew who he was, and he definitely knows who I am. But like for him to say something like that in public was very telling. And oftentimes I don't think that it was an attack on me, right? Like what we had talked about in terms of trauma, I think they were told and believe that they weren't going to be able to accomplish certain things. I think oftentimes that the people who don't necessarily support you don't support you, not because they don't want to, it's because they themselves would then be seen as not having been able to accomplish something. It makes them look bad, right? So like you're exposing something that they potentially wanted to do and they couldn't. So instead of you being able to uplift and do it, they want to bring you down. It's a crab mentality sometimes, where I think they're trying to bring you down instead of uplifting each other up.
Right. And I hate to say, but it's it's a funny adage, but that's why we can't have nice things. People say,
Yeah. 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 And that's why, I work so hard to help uplift other candidates and other people running for office, even when I know that it's not politically smart, is because I saw how hard it was for me. And like sometimes one of those days, like I had a random call from somebody that I respected that said, you're doing great, keep it up. And that made my whole week. right? So I try to do those things for other people as well, is because I know how hard it is to run for office, especially as a person of color, as a younger person. So I want to make sure that we're able to provide that support for other people as well.
So I I know that you're running for office right now. This is
Yeah.
not the same position that you're in right now, right? Or is it?
No, running for King County executive.
What's the difference, and what is? Can you describe the role that you're going to go into?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm running for King County executive, right? So right now I'm in the Washington State Legislature, which is kind of like the legislative branch, but the executive is where things kind of meet the road. And what's interesting is that I do a lot of work in criminal justice. I do a lot of work in climate. I do a lot of work in transit. I do a lot of work in homelessness. And what we do at the legislature is we pass policies, we help fund things, and we help guide directions of the conversation. But really, the people that implement it are at the local level. And King County specifically, it is the 12th largest county in the United States, 12th largest county. It is bigger than 14 states. So King County alone with 2.4, 2.3 million people is bigger than 14 states. So effectively, it's the governor of this particular area where you're in charge of the police force, you're in charge of some of the utilities, the wastewater, the buses, all that stuff. And I want to be in that role because I think right now, fundamentally, we see that we need to shift how we've been doing things. And where that truly can happen is at the county level. And it's been kind of a sleepy race for a long time. The incumbent has been there for 12 years, which is neither here nor there. I just feel like at this moment, we need change. And this is bigger than one person. This is bigger than one seat. This is more about the future of our democracy and doing things different. And I'm running for this office is because it happens to be the confluence of all the things that I care about and being able to get that stuff done. And because it's such an important seat, I think that by having a person like myself who will push for progressive policies, you can set an example for other jurisdictions, even outside of Washington State. So the reason why I want to run is because I believe we need systemic change. It's really hard to get systemic change when the people who are in power benefit from the system, but we can use this not just in order to implement the things that we know we need to do in Washington State and in King County. We can use this to show that there's a better way forward for our politics as well.
So there's actually a difference in what you'll be doing and how much influence you're going to be having from one position to another, right?
Yeah, completely different. Yeah, completely different. So I'd be managing a $12 billion budget and about 15,000 people, which is different than, say, for instance, drafting legislation and passing it through the legislature.
I mean, it sounds like you're basically a governor of.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's essentially a governor.
Right?
Yeah, it's the same similar role. Yeah.
And so I have to ask the next question then, is this preparing you for a future?
No, one of my heroes is in fact Gary Locke, former governor Gary Locke, and he was the King County executive before he became governor. And I'll be honest, like honestly, 5 years ago, I didn't think that I would ever be able to run for office, right? Like I just want to help people. I just want to serve. So I'm not terribly worried about a political office or a seat. I just want to be able to go where I think I can add the most amount of value. So if that's in the cards in the future, awesome. If not, that's also fine. I've already made comments publicly where even in my Senate seat, I was like, I'm just going to do what's right, even if it's not politically popular, because I don't care about getting reelected. I don't care about scoring political points. I just want to get things done. So for me, King County executive is where I think there's a lot of need and where I want to be able to get things done. And if it opens other doors, I can worry about it later. But right now, I just want to solve homelessness. I want to address, climate change.
Okay, so here's another thing then. If you don't get that position in King County, how else can you serve?
Because I would still be a senator.
Okay.
So my seat's not up. So I don't have to give up my Senate seat in order to win. So only if I were to win, knock on wood, would I have to give it up.
Got it. So how much more time do you have as a senator?
A year, 1 year. And then I could choose to run again if needed or something like that. Yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So you take risk. Like life is about taking risk, and it's about timing. And I think right now it's that moment where people want change. And I think we've proven that we can be very successful in the public space. What's funny is that my background is in, business in the private sector. So if you look at a lot of the folks who are executives in general, not just in Washington State, but in general, oftentimes they're lawyers. They were
Yep.
involved in some political community, got into public office, held that public office for a long time, and then became the executive. Few of them actually have executive experience. So the fact that I worked in the private sector, the fact that I work on large teams, the fact that I've helped start small businesses, I actually already come in with more executive experience than I think most folks who've ran for this office in the past.
Absolutely. When is the voting date?
August is the primary. So right now, people still have the opportunity to jump into the race, and that's due next week. So right now, it's just me and the incumbent. So there's only two of us. And if there's only two of us, then we're automatically going to go to the general election in November. But if other people jump in, then we'll have a primary election in August where we'll know for sure how well we're doing at that point.
And does there seem to be somebody who, I mean, what's the temperature on the ground? Will there be somebody who's going to jump in, or you don't
I'd
know?
imagine at least a Republican or something. So maybe we'll have somebody else jump in, but right now it's just me and another person with both Democrats. And we're gonna see. So I would be surprised if nobody else jumped in, but if nobody else did, that's also fine. So we're kind of doing our thing. Honestly, at this point, it's like if we do our thing, stick to the game plan, and tell our story, I think we'll be in good shape.
I unfortunately didn't grow up with a lot of politicians in my life, or any role models or any influence, but having you for the new generation of people of color, of Vietnamese kids, of Vietnamese girls and
Yeah,
Vietnamese boys,
yeah.
um, is so inspiring to watch. And I want to thank you for taking the hard, this is a really hard route to take in life, I think.
Yeah, it's pretty tough. It is pretty tough. I'll admit that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tough. What ultimately, what legacy ultimately do you want to leave for your children and for the Vietnamese community?
Yeah. You know what's interesting is that most legislators, when they govern, their constituents are based off of their district or where they're, been elected. When you're a Vietnamese person, when you're a person of color, I have people reaching out to me from all over Washington state that are Vietnamese, all over the country who are Vietnamese, and not even just Vietnamese people, but Asian people, people of color as well. So that's one of the things that people don't understand oftentimes is that when you're from a community that's not historically represented, people who aren't even in your district will ask you for help and you have to serve. And I think the biggest thing for me, the legacy I hope is not just what I can accomplish as an individual, but how can I uplift and amplify the voices of other people? So I want people to know that they are worthy of being discussed, right? They are worthy of having their issues be heard. They are worthy of being in that leadership role. And I want them to be the face for the future of our democracies because they will be impacted by it. So for me, the legacy is less so much about a policy or an investment or a project. It's about showing people that there is a path for them to be successful in this space, for them to be able to give back to the community as well, like I have.
When oftentimes when you're squaring up against an opponent or somebody who's against something that you're doing related to passing a bill or whatever, and that it's clearly money related or
Yeah.
some private agenda that
Yeah.
and they know it, is
Yeah.
it ever that sort of clear and concise or in your face or direct, or is it always some sort of like skin that's wrapped around the issue and it's not really what it is, but you both know? I mean, how does that play out?
Yeah, that happens all the time, right? So like there'll be multiple bills in a year. Even this year, we were told to limit the number of bills that we have to things that are pertinent to COVID. And there were a couple of bills where I'm like, what the like, why are we talking about this random thing that makes no sense? And like, I don't think anybody cares about it. And no surprise, it's because probably a donor thought it was very important, it would impact their business or something like that, right? So like that stuff happens all the time, and sometimes they get through and sometimes they don't. And when you see it, you know the fact that it's being discussed is the victory for them that people don't realize, right?
Mm.
Like they're being prioritized, whether it's good or bad. That's the victory. It isn't if they pass it or not, which obviously is the goal, but the fact that they're able to inject it into the conversation, that's a win. So for me, that's why I try so hard to advocate for the things that I care about, the things that help working class families, is because I know that there's these externalities. And that's why I try to position myself on committees or on leadership positions or help fund things that I know are important is because those things will happen. And if we just let it happen, we're going to keep perpetuating the cycle. If we push for change, that's how we get change. But yeah, there'll be times where, I'm for a bill and somebody's against the bill and it doesn't make any sense. And lo and behold, obviously, if there's a financial incentive associated with it, right? So at that point, like you have to figure out really what are people's true intentions and then really see how it would impact your communities as well.
This leads me to the next question and observation for me. Living in LA, the homelessness problem is out of control. And I'm not sure what it's like up in Washington,
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
but it makes me think about like on the receiving end of wherever that money's not going, somebody must be benefiting to allow this problem to be happening, right? It's
Yeah.
perpetuating. So somebody has to be benefiting from all this homelessness. Otherwise, why can't we clean it up? Now, do you think that this is a problem that can be cleaned up and dealt with?
Yeah. In fact, we kind of touched upon it a little bit earlier as well. But what I will say is that it's 3 times cheaper to keep somebody housed than it is to take them out of homelessness. And oftentimes the problem is more systemic. It's wealth inequality, right? So, like, if we zoom it back a little bit, the fact that in Washington state, back during the last recession, we gutted funding for basic needs programs, gutted funding for TANF, gutted funding for behavioral health, substance use disorders, didn't fund affordable housing. Yet we kept tax breaks in place for some of the largest corporations in the world, which in itself is not a bad thing per se. But if you allow for rampant inequality, where you have some of the wealthiest people to ever exist in the history of humanity living in the same county that I live in, King County, and then also don't invest in communities and don't give them a chance at opportunity and success, this is not an accident. Homelessness was not an accident. It was a policy choice. And by doing it that way did not help. And then also what we talked about earlier was that instead of trying to address the root causes of the crime, which is oftentimes
Right.
poverty, we criminalized it and we make it harder. So the path to ruins was paved with good intentions. People thought they were doing the right things, even though it made people's lives worse. So for me, I think the way that we move ourselves out of this is just acknowledge that we've been doing things wrong. The war on drugs was wrong. How we've handled behavioral health is wrong. How we've handled substance use disorder is wrong. We didn't invest enough in communities, and we need to be able to make sure that we have the resources to keep people housed. So when I was actually on a conservative radio show this morning, and they asked about this, and I was like, "Whoa, if your goal is to alleviate homelessness by like just getting people off of the streets, and that's it, that's not going to work because then you're going to see a lot more people becoming homeless. You have to address the root causes of it as well so that you stop people from becoming homeless in the first place so you can actually get things done. That's why I think we're having a hard time dealing with this, is because this is systemic inequity at play. This is tax fairness at play. This is economic inequality at play. And it's hard, again, like I said, to make these systemic changes to fix this problem when the people who are in power are benefiting from it. So even though we're, say, for instance, putting resources towards it, we're probably not putting the right amount or done in a targeted way. And I think the folks who are benefiting from the system, you know, maybe aren't prioritizing this as a need that they should be also addressing as well.
I have family members who are on the other side who would completely disagree with the way my brother and I and you see things. And
Yeah.
how do you even change that? It's such a massive mountain to me when I look out into the horizon of
Yeah.
American society. I'm like, this is my blood. Those guys are, we're related. How are you not
Yeah.
seeing what I see? Right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
again, echo chamber, I feel like we're like all in this, we only hear what we hear. And I wish that people beyond these walls of our own party, our own way of seeing things can sort of tap into understanding that we got to resolve the root cause. And they're not understanding that.
No. And I mean, it is what it is. People kind of have their feelings. But I think if you're able to show value, if you're able to get that work done, if you're able to address problems, even if they disagree with you over time when they see change, that's how you prove them wrong, right? So like that's how when I, do work, it's like I care less about what people say. I care more about what they do. And even if they disagree with me, I'm going to show a path that I think is how we move forward. If we can execute and get it done, that's maybe how we win people over. But yeah, you're right. People have very myopic viewpoints sometimes in terms of how to address a problem.
Well, I hope this whole 93% of the the bills are bipartisan, right? Is this what you said in the
Yeah,
beginning?
93% of the bills are bipartisan.
Yeah, and I hope that the rest of the United States and our world that we live in can sort of see the benefits of working together and shaking hands and getting through this, weird times. These last 10 years of it's sticky, and we can resolve it, and we can clean up the streets and live a better life.
Yeah. And it's because we have to invest in people. We have to prioritize how we use our budgets. And the legislature in Washington is starting to move towards that. And they did it this past year. I think we need to have that more systemically across the board. And that's why, like, I've been impressed with Joe Biden, to be honest. He's not known for being progressive. And some of the things that he's done, I'm like, whoa, that's awesome. Right. Like, he's going after childhood poverty. He's going after childcare costs, going after like basic needs and stuff. So I think if we did that at the local level as well, plus the state level, in a couple of years, that's how we see transformative change. That's how we get people housed, right? Like, people don't just become homeless.
Right.
It's there's a whole host of things that lead up to that happening in the first place. And if we can shore up these basic needs programs, if we can give people economic opportunities, if we're able to address kind of their needs before it becomes an issue, that's how we solve this problem.
It reminds me, I spent some time with family recently, a few weeks ago, and the oldest member of my tribe, my clan, the oldest cousin is somebody we all look up to. His name is Luai, and he's taught us all in throughout the years that the basic foundation of society is within the kids, and we have to really spend time with these children.
Yeah.
Babies that are in our family, and concentrate on giving them the lessons, no matter how tired we are, how exhausted we are. We have to give them the building blocks within our own family to take care of each other, to take care of the uncles, the ones that can't function, and really look past the differences and just be there for each other. And it reminds me of, if we approach society on that level and take care of the youngest, the most vulnerable, then we as a family, we can grow to become a lot stronger and better. And it shows up in his family. They came in 1993, and they're arguably the most successful, and I was born here. Financially, they just have their lives in order, and it's just, it shows because of the amount of detail that they took to really lay the foundations for each of the young members of their family.
Yeah, and I agree. And that's why I think, for instance, I prioritize juvenile justice, and I don't think that incarcerating young people is a good idea. And that's one of the campaign's main issues, is that the current incumbent, when he was trying to alleviate juvenile justice issues, just built a bigger jail. And I was like, no, we should have put that money towards community programs and therapeutic services and ways to actually help alleviate it. So like, it's a mindset that has to change for us to actually get there.
But it goes back to like, okay, did he put the money because he really thought that that's going to alleviate the problem, or it's because of some private money agenda that he's trying to back up some boy, like one of his boys? Like, what?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to speculate, right? But I think if you look at, who donates to whose campaign and who gets contracts, there's probably a correlation there.
Senator, thank you so much for today, and I am so touched and moved by the work that you've done, and it's so inspiring for the rest of people my generation. Thank you for the hard work that you're putting in every day.
No, thank you so much for telling our story as well. I think that's such an important thing for us to be able to hear each other and be able to support one another as well.
And I'm grateful for the time today. And I hope next year by around this time, we have some new stuff to talk about with your work.
Yeah, no, thank you so much.
Wonderful. Have a great day. Thank you for listening to The Vietnamese with Kenneth Nguyen. The Vietnamese is produced by Brittany Tran and Javier Proenza. Special thanks to Jane Nguyen, Catherine Nguyen, Tina Pham, Sydney Jamie, and Christo Trin. Please find us on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok at The Vietnamese Podcast. You can also find us on YouTube, where you can subscribe, like, and comment. Please rate and give us a review wherever you find our podcasts. Thanks again for listening.